Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1871, the county clerk of Madison County, Arkansas, made a curious notation in the official record. A single line hastily scratched through, but still legible under proper light. Kincaid property, disposition pending investigation. This seemingly mundane administrative note would become the only official acknowledgement of what locals would later call the Hollow Silence, a brutal event that claimed the lives of an entire family branch, yet somehow vanished from newspaper archives, church records, and public memory. For nearly 9 decades, the story of the Kincaid brothers remained buried in the dense forests and limestone caves of the Arkansas Ozarks, a whispered warning passed between generations that some family secrets should remain undisturbed. It wasn't until March 1967 when University of Arkansas researcher Evelyn Hawthorne discovered a collection of water-damaged journals in the basement of the Madison County Historical Society that the pieces of this dark chapter began to resurface. What she uncovered was a meticulously documented account of familial betrayal, territorial violence, and a community's collective decision to erase a tragedy too disturbing to acknowledge. The journals belonged to Thomas Burnett, a circuit riding doctor who serviced the remote homesteads scattered throughout the Ozark Hollows during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. His detailed observations, medical notations, and private reflections provide the primary window into a case that challenges our understanding of how history itself can be manipulated, obscured, and eventually forgotten. According to Hawthorne's records, the discovery of Burnett's journals was itself a matter of chance. During a routine cataloging project of materials salvaged from a flooding incident at the Historical Society in 1966, she noticed an unusual leather pouch sealed with wax and tucked behind a collection of county tax records. Inside were 14 small notebooks, their pages warped by water damage, but still largely legible. The first entry, dated April 12, 1869, established Burnett as a medical practitioner who had relocated to the Ozarks from Philadelphia following his service as a Union Army surgeon during the Civil War. I have undertaken to document the health conditions and medical cases I encounter in this remote region, Burnett wrote, not merely for my own reference, but as a contribution to medical knowledge regarding the effects of isolation, limited resources, and harsh living conditions on human physiology and psychology. The people of these mountains present unique challenges to modern medical understanding. Initially, Hawthorne had been researching folk medicine practices in isolated Ozark communities. The discovery of a trained physician's observations from this period represented a significant find for her academic work. However, as she progressed through the journals, the routine medical notations gave way to something far more disturbing, a meticulously documented account of events that had been systematically erased from official records. What follows is a chronological reconstruction of events based on Dr. Burnett's journals, land records that survived the 1887 courthouse fire, fragmentary correspondence between local officials, and oral histories collected from descendants still residing in Madison County. Some names have been altered at the request of living relatives, though the geographical locations and timeline remain faithful to the original documentation. As we piece together this narrative, we must remember that in the isolated communities of the 19th century Ozarks, justice often operated outside formal legal structures, and the line between community protection and collective conspiracy could become disturbingly blurred. The story of the Kincaid brothers, Solomon and Jeremiah, begins like many post-Civil War tales with land disputes, economic hardship, and the lingering divisions of a nation still struggling to heal. But what sets this account apart is not just the brutality of the events that unfolded in a remote homestead near the headwaters of Kings River, but the systematic erasure that followed, a conspiracy of silence that spanned generations and nearly succeeded in its goal of removing this tragedy from historical record completely. The Kincaid family had established themselves in the northwestern Arkansas Territory in the late 1830s, part of the wave of settlement that pushed into the Ozark Highlands following the forced removal of indigenous populations. By 1871, the extended family controlled several hundred acres of timber, pasture, and limestone-rich property spanning from the Kings River Valley into the higher elevations of what is now Madison County. The family patriarch, Obadiah Kincaid, had divided his considerable holdings among his 4 sons before his death in 1866, creating adjacent but separate homesteads connected by narrow, winding trails through dense oak and hickory forest. Land records examined by Hawthorne indicate that the original Kincaid property was acquired through a combination of government land grants offered to settlers willing to develop the frontier territories and subsequent purchases from other homesteaders who abandoned their claims due to the harsh conditions. Obadiah Kincaid's name first appears in territorial records in 1838, listed as the owner of 120 acres along what was then known as Bear Creek, a tributary of the Kings River. By the time of his death in 1866, the family holdings had expanded to nearly 800 acres, divided among his sons Solomon, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Abraham. Of particular note in these records is the uneven distribution of the property. Solomon, as the eldest son, received approximately 300 acres, while Jeremiah's portion amounted to only 175 acres. However, Jeremiah's land included a significant limestone cave system and what county surveys described as a year-round spring of exceptional volume and clarity. This disparity in both the quantity and quality of the inherited land would later emerge as a critical factor in the escalating tension between the brothers. Dr. Burnett's journals first mentioned the Kincaid properties in the spring of 1870, noting, "Called to the elder Kincaid place for a difficult birth." The isolation of these homesteads makes regular medical attendance nearly impossible, road conditions beyond Huntsville particularly treacherous after recent rains. The family seems prosperous compared to most in the region, though there is a palpable tension between the brothers that no one acknowledges directly. This passing observation would prove prophetic, as the tension Burnett perceived would eventually erupt into one of the most disturbing family conflicts ever documented in the region. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not just the violence itself, but how completely the subsequent events were scrubbed from official record. An erasure so effective that when Hawthorne began her research in 1967, county officials insisted no such family had ever resided in the area. The weather-beaten tombstones in a small overgrown cemetery on what was once Kincaid land tell a different story. Partial names, dates worn by nearly a century of Ozark seasons, and the unmistakable family symbol, a simple etched triangle with a horizontal line through its center, mark the final resting place of a family line that someone wanted forgotten. But as we will discover, some stories refuse to remain buried, especially when the very land itself seems to hold the memory of what transpired there. In the dense woods approximately 12 miles northeast of Huntsville, just beyond where Dry Creek feeds into the Kings River, the remains of a stone foundation still stand, the last physical evidence of the homestead, where Solomon Kincaid, his wife Rebecca, and their 5 children lived until October 1871. Local residents avoid the area even today, citing an inexplicable sense of unease that permeates the clearing. Whether this is due to knowledge of what occurred there or simply the natural human response to a place long abandoned remains a matter of speculation. What is not speculative, however, is the systematic way in which the events at the Solomon Kincaid homestead were deliberately removed from public record. Hawthorne's field notes from her initial visit to the site in April 1967 described the location as unnaturally silent, despite the spring season when bird activity should have been abundant. She wrote, "The foundation remains form a rough rectangle approximately 24 feet by 30 feet, with a smaller attached structure measuring approximately 10 feet square, likely a storage area or summer kitchen. The stonework shows evidence of skilled masonry, with corners precisely fitted without mortar. Approximately 50 yards from the main foundation is a second stone structure, partially collapsed but identifiable as a root cellar or similar storage facility. The surrounding forest has reclaimed much of the clearing, but certain anomalies in vegetation patterns suggest additional structures once stood in the vicinity. During this visit, Hawthorne collected several artifacts from the surface soil: a hand-forged iron hinge, fragments of blue-tinted glass consistent with medicinal bottles from the period, and, most significantly, a small brass button bearing the same triangular mark found on the cemetery headstones. These items, along with detailed photographs of the site, would later provide crucial physical evidence supporting the documentation in Burnett's journals when questions arose about the authenticity of his account. As we begin to reconstruct the events of that autumn, we must understand the unique geographical and social isolation that characterized life in the Ozarks during this period. The rugged terrain, with its deep valleys, rocky ridges, and dense forests, created natural barriers between communities. Travel between settlements often required day-long journeys on horseback, and many homesteads went months without outside contact, particularly during winter months when mountain trails became impassable. An account from another regional physician, Dr. James McHenry, published in the Arkansas Medical Journal in 1875, describes the challenges faced by medical practitioners in the Ozarks. The isolation of these mountain communities creates conditions unlike anything encountered in more settled regions. Families develop their own remedies, often passing knowledge through generations without external influence. Injuries that would prompt immediate professional attention elsewhere might go untreated for weeks. More concerning is the psychological impact of such isolation, which I have observed manifesting in unusual behaviors, particularly during the winter months when travel becomes impossible and families are confined together for extended periods. This isolation bred a fierce independence among Ozark families, but it also allowed conflicts to fester without the moderating influence of broader social structures. The judicial system's reach was limited, with the nearest circuit judge making only quarterly visits to county seats. In this environment, family disputes could escalate beyond the normal constraints of societal pressure, hidden from public view by miles of wilderness and the protective silence of tight-knit communities. It was in this context that the Kincaid brothers, Solomon and Jeremiah, began a dispute that would ultimately lead to consequences so disturbing that an entire community would conspire to erase them from history. The roots of their conflict, like many frontier disagreements, began with land, water rights, and inheritance. But as Dr. Burnett's journals suggest, something darker already existed between them, something that went beyond the typical sibling rivalries of 19th-century homesteading families. There is a peculiar quality to the animosity between the Kincaid brothers, Burnett wrote in April 1871. Unlike the usual disputes over boundary lines or inheritance that I regularly observe among farming families, their conflict seems rooted in something deeper, something neither will articulate even when pressed. The elder brother Solomon maintains a rigid formality in his references to Jeremiah, while the younger speaks of his brother with an intensity that borders on obsession. The wives do not visit between homesteads, contrary to the usual practice among neighboring family members, and the children are forbidden from crossing the creek that divides their properties. In a later entry dated June 6, 1871, Burnett elaborated on his observations after treating Jeremiah's younger son for a broken arm. The boy refused to explain how the injury occurred, though the nature of the break suggests a fall from height. The child became extremely agitated, insisting that "Father would rather I lose the arm than ask help from that house." When I relayed this to Jeremiah, he merely nodded, as if this were the most natural sentiment in the world, and said, "The boy understands our ways." There is something unnatural in this division, something that goes beyond the usual grievances of inheritance or boundary disputes. This unnatural division would soon deepen into something far more sinister, as economic pressures and personal grievances transformed familial tension into murderous intent. Most concerning was his reaction when I mentioned potentially sending word to his uncle Solomon's place for assistance in setting the bone. What followed would shock even the most hardened frontiersmen of Madison County and prompt a conspiracy of silence that would span generations. The spring and summer of 1871 had been particularly difficult for farmers throughout the Ozarks. Unseasonable frosts damaged early crops, followed by weeks of relentless rainfall that turned the region's clay soil into a quagmire, too waterlogged for proper planting. By August, drought conditions had set in, parching what little had managed to grow. These harsh conditions strained resources throughout Madison County, but according to Burnett's observations, the Kincaid properties seemed to weather the challenges differently. "Visited the Jeremiah Kincaid place today," reads a July entry. "Despite the drought affecting most in the county, his fields appear remarkably vital. The spring feeding his property continues to flow strongly, while others in the region have diminished to mere trickles. Solomon's land, by contrast, shows significant stress. The elder Kincaid brother appears gaunt and agitated, his demeanor markedly changed since my last visit. County records uncovered by Hawthorne reveal that Solomon had actually filed a formal complaint with the Madison County Commissioner on July 10, 1871, alleging that Jeremiah had maliciously diverted the natural flow of water through construction of an earthen dam at the headwaters of the common spring, thereby depriving adjacent properties of their rightful access to said water. The complaint was scheduled for hearing during the circuit judge's next quarterly visit in September, but records indicate the matter was never addressed, likely due to the intervening tragedy. The dispute over water rights between the brothers has evidently intensified, with Solomon accusing Jeremiah of damming the spring's outflow upstream of his property. Burnett's journal contains a detailed account of a conversation with Rebecca Kincaid, Solomon's wife, during a visit to treat their youngest child for summer fever in late July. Mrs. Kincaid spoke today of concerns regarding her husband's state of mind. She reports he has taken to patrolling their property boundaries at night, carrying his old army rifle and returning at dawn exhausted but too agitated for sleep. She confided that he has begun to make accusations beyond the water dispute, claiming Jeremiah is stealing more than just water, though he refuses to elaborate when pressed. Most concerning, she has discovered him on multiple occasions whispering to the children about protection from their uncle's influence, though he ceases immediately when she enters the room. This seemingly straightforward dispute over water resources would soon reveal itself as merely the visible manifestation of a much deeper, more disturbing conflict, one that had been simmering beneath the surface of the Kincaid family for years. As we continue to piece together this forgotten tragedy, the true nature of the brothers' relationship will emerge as the key to understanding why an entire community would choose to erase their story from history. The last known photograph of the Solomon Kincaid family, taken in Huntsville in the spring of 1871, shows 7 figures arranged in the formal style typical of the era. Solomon stands rigid and unsmiling at the center, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of his wife Rebecca, who sits with their youngest child, a girl of approximately 3 years, on her lap. The 4 older children, 3 boys and a girl, are arranged by height beside their parents, their expressions uniformly solemn. What makes this photograph particularly poignant is that within 6 months of its taking, not one of these 7 individuals would remain alive. This photograph, discovered by Hawthorne in the collection of Henrietta Davis, a descendant of the photographer's assistant, provides rare physical evidence of the family's existence. The back of the image bears a simple inscription, S. Kincaid family, April 1871. According to Davis's family lore, passed down through generations, the photographer had attempted to include this image in his portfolio, but was firmly discouraged from displaying it by certain influential men in the county. The negative plate was supposedly destroyed, making this the only surviving print. Professional analysis of the photograph conducted at Hawthorne's request by Dr. Edwin Parker, a historical photography expert at the University of Missouri, confirmed its authenticity as a genuine albumin print from the early 1870s. Parker noted several details of interest. The subject's clothing is consistent with the period, but notably more formal than typical for rural Arkansas families of the time, suggesting a level of prosperity above the regional average. Of particular interest is the visible tension in the posture of the adult male subject, whose grip on his wife's shoulder appears unnecessarily firm. The children's expressions suggest a household under significant stress, contrary to the composed facade typical of family portraiture from this era. The path to their destruction began not with violence, but with something far more insidious, a rumor. According to Burnett's careful documentation, by late summer of 1871, whispers had begun circulating through the scattered homesteads of Madison County that Jeremiah Kincaid had discovered something valuable on his property, something he was taking extraordinary measures to keep secret. Marcus Holloway reports unusual activity at the Jeremiah Kincaid property, Burnett noted in early September. Multiple wagons arriving after dark, men not known to be from the county. Some speculate he has discovered a silver deposit in the limestone caves that riddle his property, though I find this explanation unlikely given the known geology of the region. Burnett elaborated on these rumors in a subsequent entry, after speaking with Samuel Jenkins, whose property adjoined Jeremiah's land. Jenkins reports hearing the sounds of heavy labor emanating from the direction of the largest cave entrance on Kincaid's property, continuing well into the night on multiple occasions throughout August. Jeremiah has stopped attending Sunday services at the White Oak Church, and his wife offers no explanation for his absence. More concerning are his observations of strange lights moving through the woods between the cave and Kincaid's home at irregular hours, and the delivery of what appeared to be large wooden crates transported by wagon and carried into the cave entrance by multiple men. Jenkins expressed concern about approaching the property directly, stating that Jeremiah had become increasingly hostile to any perceived trespassing, allegedly firing warning shots at a local hunter who strayed too close to the cave area in pursuit of a wounded deer. These accounts of unusual activity, while initially attributed to possible mining operations, took on a more sinister cast when connected to other reports collected by Burnett. A traveling peddler named Isaiah Cooper, who regularly traversed the region selling goods to isolated homesteads, told Burnett of an unsettling encounter at the Jeremiah Kincaid property in late August. Cooper reports that upon approaching the Kincaid home, as he had done regularly for years, he was met not by family members, but by two men unknown to him, who intercepted him on the trail well before the house came into view. These men, whom Cooper described as city types, not hill folk, questioned him extensively about his business and knowledge of the area before allowing him to proceed to the house, where he was permitted to conduct his usual trade, but was not invited inside as had been customary on previous visits. Cooper noted that Jeremiah's wife appeared hollow-eyed and speaking as if reciting memorized phrases during their brief interaction, and the children were nowhere in evidence. Whatever Jeremiah had found, or whatever others believed he had found, soon became the catalyst for a rapid deterioration in the already strained relationship between the brothers. Land records from this period show an unusual transaction, Solomon attempting to file a claim challenging the original property boundaries established by their father's will, specifically targeting the area containing several cave entrances on the eastern edge of Jeremiah's land. The original petition, preserved in county records, includes Solomon's assertion that certain features of the property division, particularly regarding the limestone formations and their contents, were established under false pretenses and with deliberate concealment of material facts relevant to the value and nature of said formations. The document further alleges that Jeremiah had knowledge of certain aspects of the property, which, had they been properly disclosed to our father, would have resulted in a substantially different division of the estate. This legal maneuver, unusual for the typically self-contained dispute resolution practices of Ozark communities, suggests a level of desperation on Solomon's part. What would drive an established landowner to risk public scrutiny of family matters by bringing such a dispute before county officials? The answer, according to Burnett's journals, may lie in the precarious financial situation in which Solomon found himself by the autumn of 1871. Solomon Kincaid approached me today seeking to settle his outstanding account, reads an entry from late September. He was unable to provide payment but assured me that his circumstances would soon improve dramatically. His manner was erratic, alternating between confidential whispers about a family inheritance that was rightfully his and bitter denunciations of his brother as a thief. Most concerning was his statement that blood will have its due before departing. I have noted similar patterns of speech in patients suffering from prolonged malnutrition or certain brain fevers. In a rare personal reflection, Burnett added, I find myself increasingly concerned about the Kincaid situation. While family disputes are common in these isolated communities, there is something in Solomon's demeanor that suggests a deterioration beyond the usual grievances. His fixation on whatever he believes Jeremiah has discovered or is concealing has taken on characteristics I have previously observed only in patients with severe mental disturbances. The reference to blood is particularly troubling given the known history of violence in the region during the recent war years, when many men became accustomed to resolving conflicts through force rather than law. Whether Solomon's increasingly unstable behavior was the result of physical illness, financial pressure, or something more sinister remains unclear. What is evident from subsequent events is that by early October, whatever restraint had previously kept the brothers' conflict from turning violent had begun to erode. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the conscience of even the most hardened frontier communities, and for the extraordinary conspiracy of silence that would follow. A significant piece of context emerged during Hawthorne's 1967 research when she discovered correspondence between Sheriff William Hargrove and Circuit Judge Wilson Patterson, dated September 28, 1871. In this letter, preserved in Patterson's personal papers rather than official county records, Hargrove expressed concern about the increasingly volatile situation between the K brothers and requested guidance on preventative measures that might be taken before the next scheduled court session, as I have reason to believe matters may escalate before your honors return to the county. Patterson's response, dated October 3rd but likely not received until several days later due to the slow postal service in the region, advised Hargrove to maintain observation but avoid direct intervention, absent clear evidence of unlawful activity, as family disputes, however heated, remain outside our proper jurisdiction until such time as actual harm occurs or is imminent. This hands-off approach, typical of frontier justice systems that were often reluctant to involve themselves in family matters, would prove tragically inadequate as events rapidly accelerated toward violence. The last documented sighting of Solomon Kincaid alive comes from the Journal of Martha Greeley, a midwife whose practice occasionally overlapped with Dr. Burnett's territory. On October 7, 1871, Greeley noted passing Solomon on the narrow trail leading from Huntsville toward the Kings River settlements. She described him as wild-eyed and muttering, leading his mule rather than riding it, though the animal carried no load. When I greeted him, he stared through me as if I were not there, then suddenly asked if I had seen them on the road ahead. When I inquired who he meant, he laughed in a manner that raised the hair on my neck and continued on without answering. Greeley's journal, which came to light during Hawthorne's investigation, contains additional details not shared with Burnett at the time. I observed that Solomon's clothing was unusually clean and formal for trail travel, as if dressed for church or other important occasion. His behavior was so disturbing that upon reaching the Wilson homestead, I sent their eldest boy to alert the sheriff in Huntsville, though I know not if the message was delivered or heeded. This disturbing encounter, preserved in Greeley's private papers, discovered during the Huntsville Historical Society's archival reorganization in 1965, represents the final thread connecting Solomon Kincaid to the public record before the events that would ultimately lead to the deaths of 7 people and the near-complete erasure of their existence from historical documentation. Most concerning was the presence of what appeared to be dried blood on his hands and beneath his fingernails, though I observed no wound that might account for it. In the sheriff's records from this period, partially recovered after the 1887 courthouse fire, there is a brief notation dated October 8, 1871, message received re-SK behavior on Huntsville Road. Deputy Miller dispatched to investigate. No follow-up report exists in the preserved records, suggesting either that Deputy Miller never completed his investigation or that his findings were among the documents later deliberately removed from official files. What happened during the next 3 days remains largely a matter of informed speculation, pieced together from fragmentary evidence and the careful observations recorded by Dr. Burnett after the fact. The narrative that emerges suggests a rapid descent into violence that would forever alter the community's understanding of itself and its willingness to acknowledge certain dark potentials within human nature. According to weather records maintained by the Huntsville Postmaster, October 9 to 10, 1871, brought unusually heavy rainfall to the region, with nearly 3 inches falling in a 36-hour period. This deluge would have made travel through the already difficult mountain trails nearly impossible, potentially isolating the Kincaid properties even more completely than usual and delaying any investigation Deputy Miller might have attempted. On the morning of October 11, 1871, a Tuesday, Jacob Miller, a trapper who regularly traversed the game trails along Kings River, noticed something unusual, a plume of smoke rising from the direction of Solomon Kincaid's homestead, yet thinner and darker than the typical cook fire or hearth smoke. Concerned, particularly given the dry conditions that had persisted through September, Miller diverted his route to investigate. What he discovered at the Kincaid homestead would haunt him for the remainder of his life. In a sworn statement given to the county sheriff and transcribed in Burnett's journal, the original having disappeared from county records sometime before 1880, Miller described approaching the clearing where the Kincaid cabin stood, only to find the structure itself intact, but the doors standing open, unusual for any frontier home where protection from wildlife was a constant concern. I called out several times but received no answer, Miller testified. As I approached the cabin, I observed dark staining on the ground near the entrance. Upon reaching the doorway, I detected a powerful odor, which I recognized from my experience in the late war. Inside, I found the bodies of Mrs. Kincaid and the youngest child in the main room. Their condition prevents me from providing further details, except to say that their deaths were not the result of natural causes or accident. Miller's full testimony, as recorded by Burnett, contains details deliberately omitted from the official record, but preserved in the doctor's private cipher. The woman and child had been positioned with apparent care, the mother seated in her rocking chair with the child in her lap, both dressed in their Sunday clothes. The cause of death in both cases appeared to be precise incisions to the throat, made with considerable skill to ensure rapid exsanguination. Most disturbing was the expression on the woman's face, which showed no sign of terror or struggle, but rather a vacant serenity inconsistent with violent death. The child's eyes had been closed and a small carved wooden toy placed in its hands. This description suggests not a frenzied attack, but a methodical, almost ritual-like killing, one that would be echoed in the discoveries that followed. Miller's account continues with his discovery of the remaining Kincaid children in the loft area of the cabin, and finally Solomon himself, found in the small outbuilding used for smoking meat. All had been dead for approximately 2 days, according to Burnett's subsequent examination. The cause of death in each case was the same: precise wounds to the throat inflicted with what Burnett described as a blade of unusual sharpness, wielded with evident knowledge of human anatomy. In his detailed medical notes, Burnett observed, "The 3 older children were arranged in their sleeping pallets covered with quilts as if for regular rest, with no signs of struggle or disturbance. The 4th child, a boy of approximately 8 years, was positioned at a small writing desk, a primer open before him, as if interrupted during studies. Solomon himself presented the most anomalous case, found seated on a stool in the smoking shed, his own throat cut in identical fashion to the others, the presumed implement, a surgical quality bone knife of the type used by physicians and butchers, still clasped in his right hand. The position and angle of the wound is consistent with self-infliction, though this determination cannot be made with absolute certainty given the time elapsed since death. The methodical nature of the killings, the positioning of the bodies, and certain other details which Burnett alludes to, but does not explicitly describe in his medical notes, all pointed to a perpetrator of singular purpose and disturbing calculation. Yet the most unsettling aspect of the scene, according to Miller's testimony, was not the violence itself, but the careful arrangement of personal items throughout the cabin, clothing laid out as if for Sunday church, the family Bible open on the table, plates set as though for a meal, and a neat stack of letters placed conspicuously beside the Bible. It gave the impression not of chaos or struggle, but of a carefully arranged display, as if someone wished these deaths to be discovered and understood in a particular way. These letters, which Miller delivered to the county sheriff, and which Burnett later examined, would provide the first indication that the horror at the Solomon Kincaid homestead was merely the beginning of a much larger tragedy, one that would ultimately test the moral foundations of the entire community and lead to a conspiracy of silence that would endure for nearly a century. Miller described this tableau as like walking into a home where the family had been frozen in the midst of their daily activities, yet with the horrible alteration of death imposed upon the scene. The 7 letters found arranged on the Solomon Kincaid family table were addressed to various community members: the pastor of White Oak Church, the county sheriff, 2 neighboring families, Dr. Burnett himself, and, most significantly, Jeremiah Kincaid. The final letter was addressed simply to "those who find us." According to Burnett's journal, the sheriff allowed him to read each letter before they were secured as evidence. Their contents, which Burnett recorded in his private cipher, later decoded during Hawthorne's 1967 research, outlined a narrative so disturbing that the doctor questioned whether they could possibly be genuine. "The letters are written in Solomon's hand, which I recognize from previous correspondence," Burnett noted. Yet the content suggests either complete detachment from reality or a depth of malice that exceeds anything I have encountered in my medical practice. Solomon claims to have discovered that his brother Jeremiah has been engaged in activities of such a depraved nature that the only recourse was the complete extinction of the Kincaid bloodline. Burnett's decoded transcription of the letter, addressed to "those who find us," provides the most comprehensive insight into Solomon's thinking. "Know that what you have discovered here is not murder, but mercy. I have delivered my family from a corruption that would have claimed their souls as surely as it has claimed my brother's. 3 nights past, I observed with my own eyes the abomination that Jeremiah has harbored in the caves beneath his land, a desecration of all natural and divine law that no righteous man could witness and permit to continue. The taint of such evil cannot be contained. It spreads like poison through water, and all who share our blood are at risk of contamination. May God forgive what man cannot understand." The specific accusations against Jeremiah were redacted even in Burnett's private journal, with the doctor noting only that they involved violations of natural and divine law of the most severe order. What is clear from Burnett's subsequent entries is that Solomon's letters detailed not only his reasons for taking the lives of his own family members, an act he characterized as mercy compared to the fate that awaited them otherwise, but also his intention to continue his mission of purification by eliminating Jeremiah and his household as well. I have prayed for guidance and received clear instruction. The Kincaid line must end completely to ensure the corruption is not perpetuated. By the time you read these words, I will have completed the Lord's work at my brother's homestead as well. The letter addressed specifically to Jeremiah, which Burnett transcribed more fully, contained additional details. Brother, by the time you read this, if indeed you can still comprehend human language, you will know that I have discovered the true purpose of your excavations and the nature of what you have unearthed and nurtured beneath our father's land. I observed your midnight communion from the southern ridge overlooking the cave entrance. I saw the offerings brought in by wagon and carried below. I heard the sounds no human throat should produce. The ancient evil you have awakened cannot be permitted to spread beyond our blood. I have released my wife and children from its influence through the mercy of quick passage. Your family will receive the same compassion. As for you and the abomination you serve, I come with fire and blade to end what never should have begun. The most chilling aspect of the letters, according to Burnett, was the cold rationality with which Solomon outlined his plans. There was no evidence of the rambling or disorganized thinking that might suggest acute mental illness. Instead, the letters presented a carefully constructed moral framework in which Solomon cast himself not as a murderer, but as a reluctant agent of necessary justice, a perspective that would find disturbing resonance among certain community members as subsequent events unfolded. Burnett noted his own reaction to the letters. Having read these communications, I find myself uncertain whether we are dealing with the actions of a man in the grip of delusional psychosis or something far more disturbing, the possibility that Solomon's accusations, however fantastical they might seem, could contain some element of truth. The precision of his descriptions regarding the cave system on Jeremiah's property, the specific references to deliveries and activities that correspond with reports from multiple independent sources, and the clinical detachment with which he describes his own horrific actions all suggest a mind that, while clearly operating outside normal moral constraints, retains significant connection to observed reality. Upon reading the letters, Sheriff William Hargrove immediately organized a group of men to ride to Jeremiah Kincaid's property, fearing that Solomon might already have carried out the second phase of his planned violence. Burnett accompanied this group, bringing his medical kit, though harboring little hope of finding survivors. The 12-mile journey through difficult terrain took nearly 3 hours, during which an unseasonable thunderstorm developed, further hampering their progress. In his journal, Burnett described the atmosphere among the men during this journey. An unusual silence prevailed throughout our ride, broken only by necessary communications regarding the trail conditions. Sheriff Hargrove instructed all present to speak of these matters to no one beyond our immediate group, citing concerns about unnecessary public alarm. I note, however, that Marcus Holloway and James Sutton, both of whom own property adjacent to the Kincaid lands, exchanged significant glances at this instruction, suggesting they may have prior knowledge relevant to these events. As the group finally approached the Jeremiah Kincaid homestead around dusk, they were met with a scene that initially suggested they had arrived too late. The main house was engulfed in flames, visible through the trees from nearly a quarter-mile distant. Several of the men who had read or been informed of the contents of Solomon's letters seemed deeply troubled, not merely by the horror we had discovered, but by the specific nature of the accusations against Jeremiah. The rain, now falling heavily, had no impact on the intensity of the fire, suggesting it had been burning hot for some time before their arrival. Sheriff Hargrove divided his men, sending some to secure the perimeter, while others, including Burnett, approached the burning structure to determine if anyone remained inside. It was at this moment, as the group entered the clearing surrounding the homestead, that the already grim situation took an even more disturbing turn, one that would ultimately lead the community to collectively decide that some events are better left undocumented. As Sheriff Hargrove's men approached the burning Jeremiah Kincaid homestead, the downpour intensified, reducing visibility to mere yards. Through the curtain of rain and the orange glow of the fire, Burnett recorded seeing a figure emerge from the tree line opposite their position, a man moving with purpose toward the burning structure. The sheriff called out for the figure to identify himself, but instead of responding, the man raised what appeared to be a rifle. The scene that followed remains chaotic in my recollection, Burnett wrote. Multiple shots were fired almost simultaneously, the sound partially masked by a tremendous thunderclap. The figure staggered but remained upright, continuing toward the burning house with determined strides, despite what appeared to be at least one serious wound. Sheriff Hargrove and Deputy Collins intercepted the man before he could reach the flames, and in the struggle that ensued, his face became visible in the firelight. It was indeed Jeremiah Kincaid, though his appearance was so altered that I might not have recognized him had I not been specifically looking for him. His eyes were wide and unblinking despite the rain, his expression one of singular focus rather than pain or fear despite his injuries. In the confusion that followed, several of the sheriff's men fired their weapons. The figure dropped, and when the group reached him, they discovered Jeremiah Kincaid, wounded but alive, a hunting rifle clutched in his hands. The subsequent search of the burning property and surrounding areas yielded no other survivors. Jeremiah's wife and their 2 children were eventually found inside the charred remains of the house, though, according to Burnett's clinical notes, the fire alone was not the cause of their deaths. The positioning of the remains and certain wounds evident despite the fire damage suggest that the victims were deceased before the conflagration began. Burnett wrote, "The manner of their deaths bears striking similarity to those at Solomon's homestead, raising disturbing questions about the sequence of events and Jeremiah's presence outside the structure rather than within it." Further examination of the property, conducted the following morning once the rain had subsided, revealed additional disturbing details. Approximately 100 yards from the main house, the entrance to a substantial limestone cave was found, its opening partially obscured by natural vegetation, but showing clear signs of recent and frequent use. The ground surrounding this entrance bore unusual markings that several members of the search party identified as not natural to any animal known in these parts, according to Burnett's account. The sheriff organized a small group to investigate the cave, but their exploration was cut short when they discovered evidence of a recent collapse approximately 30 feet inside the entrance. Whether this collapse was natural or deliberately triggered remained unclear, though Burnett noted that fragments of what appeared to be blasting powder containers were found near the sealed portion of the passage, suggesting human intervention rather than natural structural failure. Jeremiah Kincaid, suffering from both gunshot wounds and severe burns to his hands and face, was transported to Huntsville under guard. During the 3-day journey complicated by continuing rain and Jeremiah's deteriorating condition, Burnett attempted to question him about what had transpired. The doctor's notes from these conversations reveal a narrative far more complex and ultimately more disturbing than a simple case of fratricidal violence. According to Burnett, Jeremiah claimed that he had returned from a 2-day hunting trip to find his family already dead and his home ablaze. He had retrieved his rifle from its hiding place in the barn and was preparing to search the surrounding forest for the perpetrator when the sheriff's party arrived. When confronted with Solomon's letters and their accusations, Jeremiah reportedly became agitated to the point that Burnett had to administer sedatives to prevent him from reopening his wounds. He denies all allegations with such vehemence that I am inclined to believe him, Burnett noted. Yet certain inconsistencies in his account cannot be easily dismissed. The timing of his alleged hunting trip coincides precisely with the estimated time of his family's deaths. Furthermore, he cannot account for how Solomon, last seen alive by Martha Greeley on October 7th, could have reached Jeremiah's property, committed these acts, and disappeared, especially given Solomon's documented physical condition. During periods of greater lucidity, Jeremiah provided additional details that further complicated the narrative. He claimed that tensions with his brother had indeed escalated in recent months, but not over the water rights dispute that was publicly known. According to Jeremiah, the true conflict stemmed from Solomon's increasing religious fanaticism and his objection to Jeremiah's exploration of the cave system on his property. Jeremiah states that the caves contain unusual rock formations and what he believes to be artifacts of indigenous populations who used the chambers for ceremonial purposes before white settlement, Burnett recorded. He admits to bringing several men from Fayetteville to examine these findings, including a professor from the Arkansas Industrial University whom he identifies as Dr. Walter Kimball. According to Jeremiah, Solomon became convinced that these explorations were unholy and represented interference with things meant to remain buried. This religious objection apparently intensified following a spring revival at the White Oak Church, after which Solomon began making specific accusations about pagan worship and communion with dark forces. Hawthorne's subsequent research could find no record of a Dr. Walter Kimball associated with what would later become the University of Arkansas during this period, though university records from the early 1870s are notably incomplete. She did, however, discover a mention in the Fayetteville Observer, dated May 1871, of local amateur historians exploring notable cave systems throughout Washington and Madison counties, documenting evidence of pre-settlement habitation. No specific names were mentioned in this brief article. The situation was further complicated when a search party returned to Solomon's homestead and discovered his body was no longer where Jacob Miller had reported finding it. The smoking outbuilding had been completely emptied of its contents, including Solomon's remains. This unexpected development threw the entire chronology of events into question and introduced the possibility that neither Miller's initial report nor Jeremiah's account was entirely accurate. Burnett's journal expresses his growing confusion. The disappearance of Solomon's body represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of this increasingly incomprehensible situation. Sheriff Hargrove has dispatched men to search the surrounding area, but given the heavy rainfall and difficult terrain, I hold little hope of discovery. The implications are disturbing. Either someone removed the body for unknown purposes, or Solomon himself was not deceased as reported by Miller. The latter possibility seems medically improbable given Miller's description of the wound and Burnett's preliminary examination, yet no other explanation readily presents itself. By the time the party reached Huntsville on October 15th, Jeremiah Kincaid's condition had worsened significantly. Infection had set into his wounds, and he alternated between periods of feverish delirium and unsettling lucidity. It was during one of these latter phases, on the evening of October 16th, that Jeremiah requested a private conversation with both Dr. Burnett and Sheriff Hargrove. What he revealed during this meeting would never be officially recorded, but Burnett's encrypted journal entry from that night contains a single cryptic sentence. "The ground beneath the elder oak holds the truth of it, J.K." In a separate entry dated October 17th, Burnett elaborated slightly on this cryptic statement. Upon further questioning, J.K. provided additional context regarding the elder oak reference. He directed us to a specific tree on his property, approximately 200 yards east of the cave entrance, describing it as the largest oak in the county, with a trunk that splits and rejoins in a manner resembling a closed eye. According to J.K., excavation beneath this tree would reveal evidence supporting his version of events and explaining Solomon's increasingly erratic behavior over recent months. He refused to specify the nature of this evidence, stating only that, once seen, the truth cannot be undone. The following morning, Jeremiah Kincaid was found dead in his secured room, having somehow obtained and ingested a lethal quantity of laudanum, despite being under constant observation. With his death, the last direct witness to whatever had truly transpired between the Kincaid brothers was gone, leaving only circumstantial evidence and contradictory accounts. Sheriff Hargrove's official report, filed on October 18, 1871, concluded that Jeremiah Kincaid had taken his own life due to remorse over his actions or fear of judicial consequences. The report further stated that based on available evidence, Jeremiah had murdered his own family and set fire to his home in an attempt to conceal the crimes, likely after learning that his brother Solomon had discovered evidence of prior unlawful activities and threatened exposure. Solomon's death and those of his family were attributed to Jeremiah as well, with the sheriff speculating that Jeremiah had traveled to Solomon's homestead, committed the murders, arranged the scene to suggest Solomon's involvement, planted the letters, and then returned to his own property to eliminate remaining witnesses. This official narrative, while plausible on its surface, failed to address numerous inconsistencies and unanswered questions. The missing body of Solomon, the timeline discrepancies, the unusual precision of the fatal wounds, the strange markings near the cave entrance, and perhaps most significantly, the reference to evidence buried beneath the elder oak. Yet this account became the basis for what limited public record would remain of the events, with numerous details omitted entirely from the filed report. It was at this point that something unprecedented occurred, something that would have remained unknown were it not for Burnett's meticulous private documentation. On October 18, 1871, a meeting was convened at the White Oak Church, attended by Sheriff Hargrove, Judge Wilson Patterson, Pastor Thomas Ledbetter, Dr. Burnett, and 7 other prominent community members. The purpose of this gathering, according to Burnett, was to determine what account of recent events should be presented to the broader public and preserved in official record. This extraordinary proceeding, essentially a formalized conspiracy to alter historical fact, resulted in a unanimous decision. The Kincaid tragedy, in its full scope and with its most disturbing elements, would be deliberately obscured. The official record would reflect only that both families had perished in separate accidents, the Solomon Kincaid family in a cabin fire caused by a lightning strike, and the Jeremiah Kincaid family in a similar incident days later. Jeremiah's death would be attributed to wounds sustained while trying to rescue his family. Burnett's detailed account of this meeting provides rare insight into a community's deliberate decision to engage in historical erasure. The discussion was initiated by Judge Patterson, who expressed concern about the potential impact of the full narrative becoming widely known. He cited 3 specific concerns. First, the detrimental effect on county settlement and development. Second, the possibility of triggering further violence through misunderstanding or vengeance. And third, most significantly, the potential implications for other families in the region who had engaged in business dealings with Jeremiah Kincaid, particularly regarding the materials and labor provided for his cave explorations. The judge reportedly argued that no public good could be served by preserving the complete account, and that the reputation and welfare of innocent parties, including the remaining Kincaid brothers and their families, would be irreparably damaged by association. He proposed instead a compassionate revision that would preserve the dignity of the deceased while protecting the living from unnecessary trauma and suspicion. Not all present initially agreed with this approach. Burnett records that Pastor Ledbetter in particular argued for transparency before God and man, suggesting that concealment of sin serves only to perpetuate its power. This position was countered by Marcus Holloway, one of the neighboring landowners, who asserted that some knowledge is too dangerous for general consumption, and that the spiritual welfare of the community would be better served by allowing these events to be understood as tragic accidents, rather than manifestations of deeper evil. The motivations for this decision, as Burnett understood them, were complex. There was concern about the reputation of the county, already struggling to attract settlers and investment in the difficult post-war years. More significantly, there was genuine fear about the impact the full story might have on community cohesion, particularly given certain elements of the case that Burnett alludes to but never explicitly describes, elements connected to whatever was discovered beneath the elder oak on Jeremiah's property. The judgment of those present, Burnett wrote, is that some truths serve no purpose beyond inflicting harm on the innocent. What happened between the Kincaid brothers has implications that extend beyond their immediate families, potentially casting suspicion on individuals who had no direct involvement, but who might be unfairly implicated through association or circumstance. The decision, while contrary to my personal belief in the primacy of factual documentation, is one I cannot in good conscience oppose. The meeting concluded with a formal oath sworn by all present on Pastor Ledbetter's Bible to maintain the agreed-upon narrative and to actively discourage any alternative accounts. Specific responsibilities were assigned. Sheriff Hargrove would ensure all official documentation reflected the revised version of events. Judge Patterson would handle any legal questions that might arise. Pastor Ledbetter would provide appropriate spiritual guidance to the congregation regarding how to discuss and remember the tragedy. And Dr. Burnett would ensure medical records contained no contradictory information. With this entry, Burnett effectively acknowledges his own complicity in what would become one of the most successful historical erasures ever documented. For nearly a century, the true fate of the Kincaid families remained known only to those present at that meeting and whatever information they chose to share with their closest confidants. The official records reflected the agreed-upon narrative. Land ownership was quietly redistributed, and within a generation, the very existence of the Kincaid brothers had faded from public memory. The effectiveness of this conspiracy of silence is perhaps best illustrated by an entry in Burnett's journal dated September 1872, less than a year after the events. Attended service at White Oak Church today, where Pastor Ledbetter delivered a sermon on the importance of community resilience in the face of tragedy. He made reference to the unfortunate accidents of last autumn that claimed 2 good families, but provided no further specificity. I observed several of those present at our October meeting exchanging glances during this reference, but no overt reaction was visible among the broader congregation. It appears our collective decision has taken hold. The revised account is now accepted as historical fact, with few, if any, questions raised regarding details or inconsistencies. By 1875, when Burnett relocated to Little Rock, the Kincaid properties had been absorbed by neighboring landowners. The remaining physical evidence of the homesteads had largely deteriorated or been deliberately removed, and local discussion of the events had effectively ceased. Burnett's final entry regarding the case, dated April 1875, notes, "As I prepare to depart this region, I find myself reflecting on the Kincaid affair and our decision to alter its historical record. I cannot determine whether our actions represented wisdom or cowardice, protection or complicity. I maintain these private journals in their entirety, encoded against casual discovery, as my personal testimony to what actually transpired, a record that may never be examined, but which preserves the truth that we collectively chose to obscure." It would take Evelyn Hawthorne's accidental discovery of Burnett's journals in 1967 to begin unraveling this carefully constructed fiction, and even then, her research would encounter significant resistance from descendants of those original conspirators still residing in Madison County. The question that drove her investigation, and which continues to haunt those familiar with the case, is deceptively simple. What could have been so terrible that an entire community would choose to erase it from history rather than allow it to be known? The answer, or at least part of it, may lie in what was discovered during a clandestine excavation conducted in May 1967 by Hawthorne and two graduate students at the site identified in Burnett's journal as the Elder Oak, on what was once Jeremiah Kincaid's property. This location, now part of a privately owned hunting preserve, required Hawthorne to obtain permission under the pretense of conducting soil sampling for an agricultural study. What her team unearthed there would provide the first physical evidence supporting Burnett's account, and suggests that the full horror of the Kincaid tragedy extended far beyond the 14 documented victims from the two immediate families. According to Hawthorne's field notes, included as an appendix to her unpublished manuscript, the excavation beneath the massive oak tree, estimated to be approximately 200 years old at the time, revealed a disturbing discovery, a collection of personal effects belonging to at least 23 distinct individuals, including jewelry, buttons, eyeglasses, and other items that could be dated to the period between 1860 and 1871. Hawthorne's detailed inventory of these items includes 17 distinct wedding bands or rings of similar purpose, varying in composition from simple iron bands to gold with semi-precious stones, 23 pairs of eyeglasses or spectacle fragments, 42 buttons of various materials including bone, shell, brass, and pewter, 9 pocket watches in various states of preservation, 14 belt buckles, and numerous smaller personal items including hair combs, tobacco pipes, pencil stubs, and pocket knife fragments. More significantly, they discovered human remains, fragmentary and deliberately interred in a manner suggesting concealment rather than respectful burial. Of particular note were several items bearing initials or names that correspond to individuals reported missing in northwestern Arkansas and southwestern Missouri between 1865 and 1871, according to newspaper archives I have consulted. The condition and arrangement of these remains led Hawthorne to consult Dr. Martin Fletcher, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee, who examined photographs and detailed descriptions of the site. His preliminary assessment, included in correspondence with Hawthorne, dated June 28, 1967, suggested that the remains showed evidence of methodical dismemberment consistent with someone possessing considerable anatomical knowledge and technical skill with bladed implements. Fletcher's analysis noted, the cut marks visible on the bone fragments indicate the use of a remarkably sharp implement, possibly a surgical grade instrument, wielded with precision rather than force. Most significant is the apparent ritualistic arrangement of certain remains, particularly the placement of cranial fragments in what appears to be a deliberate geometric pattern beneath a layer of carefully selected stones. This grim discovery added a disturbing new dimension to the Kincaid case, suggesting that what Solomon had uncovered about his brother, the revelation that drove him to eliminate his own family rather than allow them to live with the knowledge, may have been evidence that Jeremiah Kincaid was responsible for numerous disappearances throughout the region in the years following the Civil War. The consistency of technique across multiple specimens suggests a single individual responsible for the majority of the dissections, though some variations in approach may indicate a second, less skilled participant in at least some cases. If this interpretation is correct, it transforms the narrative from one of simple fratricidal violence to something far more complex. A man discovering his brother is a methodical killer, then choosing to become one himself, rather than expose the family's shame. Yet even this explanation fails to account for certain elements of the case, particularly the questions surrounding Solomon's missing body and the precise timing of events between October 7th and October 11th, 1871. If Solomon had indeed killed his own family and then proceeded to Jeremiah's property to continue his self-appointed mission of justice, how do we explain the evidence suggesting that all victims at both homesteads died within the same approximate 24-hour period? And if Jeremiah was the perpetrator of all 14 murders, How do we reconcile this with the eyewitness accounts, placing him miles from Solomon's homestead during the critical period? The most unsettling possibility, and the one that Hawthorne ultimately concluded was most consistent with all available evidence, is that both brothers were active participants in whatever horrific activities were centered around the elder oak, and that the violence that claimed their families was the culmination of a pact between them, a final extension of whatever dark bond had existed beneath the surface of their apparent animosity. Hawthorne's unpublished manuscript proposes a chilling hypothesis. The evidence suggests not a conflict between the brothers, but a collaboration, one that began perhaps as early as their military service during the Civil War, where both served in the same Union regiment and were noted for their effectiveness in scouting and intelligence gathering behind Confederate lines. The nature of their activities at the cave and beneath the elder oak appears to have been known to both, with their public animosity serving as a convenient disguise for their true relationship. The theatrical nature of the killings, the carefully crafted letters, the missing body, and the deliberate fire all point to a planned performance rather than a spontaneous eruption of violence. She further speculates, the October tragedy may represent not the culmination of a fraternal conflict but the execution of a suicide pact that expanded to include their families, a final act of twisted loyalty to whatever bond had united them in their darker pursuits. The community's extraordinary efforts to erase all record of these events suggests knowledge or suspicion of this relationship and its implications for other prominent families who may have been aware of or even complicit in aspects of the brothers' activities. This theory, while speculative, would explain the community's extraordinary efforts to erase the entire affair from public record. The implication that two seemingly respectable property owners, men who attended church, participated in community governance, and were related by blood to several other prominent families in the county, could harbor such capacity for calculated violence would have profound implications for how the community understood itself and its members. Better to create a fiction of tragic accidents than to acknowledge the possibility that such darkness could exist undetected among them. The final piece of evidence supporting this interpretation came from an unexpected source. In July 1967, while researching military records related to the Kincaid brothers, Hawthorne discovered a significant connection. Both Solomon and Jeremiah had served not merely in the same Union regiment as previously known, but specifically in a specialized scouting unit commanded by Major Harrison Wilcox, who was later court-martialed, though ultimately acquitted, for alleged atrocities committed against civilian populations in northern Arkansas. A surviving deposition from this court-martial, provided by a Confederate prisoner who had witnessed one such execution, describes soldiers under Wilcox's command using surgical precision to dispatch victims while they were fully conscious, positioning the bodies in tableaus meant to send messages to other Confederate supporters. The witness further noted that two brothers among the unit appeared to take particular satisfaction in these activities, often remaining behind after others had departed to engage in some private ritual over the remains. While the deposition did not name the Kincaid brothers specifically, the timeline and unit assignments strongly suggest their involvement. The charges, while dismissed due to insufficient evidence, included accusations of ritualistic executions of suspected Confederate sympathizers, executions that bore striking similarities to the manner in which the Kincaid family members were killed. This military connection provides a plausible origin for the skills and psychological conditioning that would later manifest in the horrors discovered beneath the elder oak, and potentially explains the community's willingness to engage in such extraordinary measures to conceal the truth, particularly in a region where Civil War loyalties remained divisive and potentially dangerous even years after the conflict's official conclusion. Hawthorne's investigation came to an abrupt end in September 1967 when a fire of suspicious origin destroyed her office at the University of Arkansas, including most of her research materials. The original Burnett journals, which had been returned to the Madison County Historical Society, disappeared during a reorganization of the archive in 1968. Hawthorne herself accepted a position at a university in California shortly thereafter and never returned to the Kincaid case, her partially completed manuscript languishing in the Special Collections Department of the University Library until it was discovered during digitization efforts in 2015. In a brief interview conducted for this investigation in 2018, Hawthorne, then in her late 70s, reflected on her aborted research. "I've often wondered if I came too close to something that some people still felt needed protection, even after nearly a century. The resistance I encountered went beyond typical academic skepticism or historical territoriality. There was a quality of fear, not just of revision to accepted history, but of something more fundamental, as if revealing the truth about the Kincaid brothers might somehow awaken whatever darkness they had harbored." When asked about her personal conclusions regarding what truly happened in Madison County in October 1871, Hawthorne was circumspect. "The evidence points to something far more complex than a simple case of fratricidal violence or even serial murder. The community's extraordinary efforts at erasure, the ritualistic elements of the killings, the military background, the cave explorations, all suggest a narrative that goes beyond conventional understanding of crime and motive. Whatever Solomon discovered about his brother, or perhaps about himself, was deemed too dangerous for preservation, not just by the brothers themselves, but by an entire community of otherwise upstanding citizens. That collective decision tells us more, perhaps, than any of the physical evidence ever could. The physical evidence excavated from beneath the elder oak was allegedly transferred to the state crime laboratory for further analysis, but no record of its receipt or examination exists in official files. When contacted by researchers in 2016, the Madison County Sheriff's Department stated that they had no information regarding any investigation related to the Kincaid family or properties, past or present. Thus, the conspiracy of silence that began with a meeting of 12 community leaders in 1871 has largely succeeded in its aim, despite Hawthorne's brief penetration of the veil. The true nature of what transpired between the Kincaid brothers, the extent of their crimes, and the reasons for the community's extraordinary efforts to conceal them remain largely matters of informed speculation rather than documented fact. What we can say with certainty is this: something happened in Madison County, Arkansas in the autumn of 1871 that was so disturbing that an entire community chose to expunge it from history. The decision to do so, to collectively agree that some truths are too dark to preserve, raises profound questions about historical memory, community responsibility, and the human capacity for both unimaginable violence and extraordinary conspiracy. The land where the Kincaid properties once stood has changed hands numerous times in the intervening century and a half. The foundations of Solomon's cabin were bulldozed during timber harvesting operations in the 1950s. The site of Jeremiah's homestead became part of a private hunting preserve in the 1970s. The charred remains of the original structure long since reclaimed by the forest. The elder oak, however, still stands, a living monument to secrets buried both literally and figuratively beneath its spreading branches. Local residents, when asked about the area, typically claim no knowledge of its history, though some acknowledge its reputation as a place to be avoided. "There's spots in these hills where the air just feels wrong," one longtime Madison County resident told a researcher in 2018, requesting anonymity. "Places where the birds don't sing and nothing grows right. Old-timers wouldn't talk about why, just said, some ground gets poisoned by what happens on it. That's all I know." Another resident, a descendant of one of the 12 men present at the 1871 meeting, though unaware of this connection, offered a similar observation. "My grandfather would never hunt past Dry Creek Ridge, said there was an oak tree out that way that marked bad ground. Wouldn't explain what he meant, just said some things are better left alone. I respected his wisdom enough not to press for details." Whether this represents the last echo of knowledge passed down through generations or simply the natural human tendency to attribute malevolence to places associated with tragedy is impossible to determine. What remains clear is that the effort to erase the Kincaid brothers and their terrible legacy from historical record was remarkably successful. So successful that even now, with the primary documents partially recovered and the basic outline of events reconstructed, we are left with more questions than answers. Perhaps this is fitting. Some historical events resist clear resolution, existing instead as cautionary shadows at the edges of our understanding. The case of the Kincaid brothers and the Macabre family massacre that was nearly erased from history stands as a reminder that our knowledge of the past is always incomplete, filtered through the decisions of those who came before about what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. In the dense forests of the Ozarks, where mist clings to the hollows and ancient trees bear silent witness to generations of human passage, the land itself seems to embody this tension between remembering and forgetting. For those who know what to look for, the signs are still there. The unusual configuration of stones that once formed a foundation, the unnatural clearing where a homestead once stood, the massive oak with its suspicious mound of earth beneath gnarled roots. These physical remnants, like Burnett's recovered journals and Hawthorne's aborted research, offer tantalizing glimpses of a truth that remains just beyond our grasp, a truth that perhaps, as those 12 community leaders decided in 1871, is better left partially obscured. Whether their decision represented wisdom or cowardice, protection or complicity, is a judgment that each of us must make individually, based on our own understanding of what history owes to both the dead and the living. For the Kincaid brothers, their families, and whatever other victims may lie beneath the elder oak, the most we can offer now is acknowledgement that they existed, that something terrible befell them, and that the full measure of that tragedy was deemed too unbearable to be preserved in memory. Perhaps in the end, that acknowledgement is both the least and the most that history can provide. The shadow of the elder oak grows longer as the sun sets over the Ozark highlands, its branches reaching like grasping fingers across ground that holds secrets a community chose to bury. In the distance, a whippoorwill begins its evening call, a mournful sound that seems to echo across the years, a reminder that while documents can be destroyed, records falsified, and memories suppressed, some stories continue to resonate through time, waiting for those willing to listen. And so, the tale of the Kincaid brothers, a macabre family massacre nearly erased from history, remains neither fully revealed nor completely forgotten, suspended in the liminal space between documented fact and fading legend, a disturbing footnote in the complex and often troubling history of a land shaped by both remarkable beauty and unfathomable darkness.